everyone. Welcome to the 10 and 2 podcast. I'm Kat.
And I'm Catlin.
And we're here every week talking watches, photography, adventure, and exploring the world of horology. How are you?
I am doing very well. How are you, Kat?
I'm great. I'm getting ready to move. It's getting closer and closer. And it's
so
getting exciting and nervous. I was talking to you before and you got to hear all of my worries and everything else, my panic attack that I just had because I hadn't really started packing yet. It's fine.
I love that you haven't started packing yet, and we literally just talked about this the last time I saw you.
I know.
And you were all like, oh, I barely have anything.
Well,
I'll pack it all up this weekend.
That
and
is
Sunday
true.
night.
But in my defense, we were waiting on the appraisal to come through, which, we didn't want to pack our house and then something happened and then, we'd have to put it back on the market. So now that we're through that, I can officially start it. So yeah, I'm excited. Lots of exciting things happening. Unfortunately, we won't be recording together, for the next probably few weeks, which really sucks, but we'll manage. Because,
yeah,
we're pros, right?
We'll make it work.
Aren't we?
Yeah.
No?
We're yeah, something like that. I don't know. If you heard the original intro to this episode, we are not pros.
No. I might put that as a blooper or something at the end. I haven't done that in a while.
Awesome. Well, but today's episode is super exciting because we have been asked 1,000 times about vintage watches.
Mm-hmm.
And other than our eBay experiences, which we've learned is not the right thing to do, we don't have any vintage watch experience. So we have a special guest on the show today.
Yeah, we have Eric Wind from Wind Vintage, and he used to write for Hodinkee. He was a senior watch specialist over at Christies. And yeah, he's basically just a scholar in the world of vintage watches. And he just has a huge amount of knowledge. And we got to pick his brain and it was amazing. And, we asked for listener questions for this episode. You guys came through and asked some really great questions.
Yes,
some that I really wouldn't have thought of, but I was incredibly interested in. And Eric showed up wow, learned so. This was the most informative episode of the podcast I think we've ever had. What do you think?
I think so too. I think it's one of the more interesting interviews we've had too. Not because of Eric necessarily, but I think honestly for you and I, we learned so much through this episode, and we kind of fed off of, we had all of these amazing listener questions, and then we kind of dove in a little bit deeper on some, which was super awesome. And yeah, there was so much that I learned during this episode, and I'm really excited for everyone to hear it.
Absolutely. Also, we learned, eBay, we got to be careful. We made some mistakes, but you'll hear more about that on the show from Eric. And he was incredibly nice. And it couldn't have been a better interview. We're so glad that he was able to join us on the show. And we look forward to maybe having him back one day, maybe for a part 2.
Yes, most definitely. And then I guess with that, hope y'all enjoy the show.
Yep. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by Houdinki Insurance, a new venture partnering both Houdinki and Chubb, 2 industry leaders in their respective fields. Houdinki Insurance is a refreshing new way to protect the timepieces we enjoy and collect. It's a true game changer in that it was designed by watch enthusiasts for watch enthusiasts, and it makes the process of insuring your watches as simple as possible by eliminating the typical pain points that can make insuring your timepieces difficult. Stay tuned later in the episode for more information, and be sure to check out insurance.houdinki.com or download the Hodinkee app on iOS or Android. Well, good morning. Hey, Eric, how are you?
Great. How about you?
Good. Thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate it and very, very excited about it.
This has been almost a lifelong dream for me to be on the podcast.
Stop it. Stop.
It's way too early in the morning for all this flattery.
Yeah, exactly.
No, thank you for coming, for real. Thank you for answering our emails.
No, thank you.
Yeah,
awesome.
we're very humbled. So, Eric, we have a lot of listeners that know who you are, but we have a lot that are beginners in the hobby and are just getting into watches and may not know too much about you. So if you could briefly just kind of give us an overview of how you got into vintage watches and what led you to where you are now.
Yeah, I got my first interest in vintage watches when I inherited my grandfather's Hamilton, which was a gift from my grandmother to him for their wedding.
Oh my gosh.
In 1947. And that was my first mechanical watch. I inherited it while I was in college. And then I came across in the early days a blog called Hodinkee that no one had heard of at the time back in 2008. And then just began reading the articles kind of religiously, coming across vintage watch forums. By 2010, I was emailing Ben Clymer, look at this cool watch for sale and check this out. You should write about this. And then he said, why don't you write about it? I'm thinking I'm about to pursue Columbia Journalism School, so I'm going to need help. And I can't pay you anything, but it should be fun. So I said, wow, I'd love to. That's awesome. And the rest was history. I began writing for Hodinkee. It was obviously just a hobby. Was doing other work, and then sort of developed a following. Obviously learned a lot over the course of writing for 5 years and talking to collectors and everything else. By 2015, I had a job offer from Christies and decided to pursue that and move into watches full time, and haven't looked back. I was at Christies over 2 years before I decided to start my own firm, which I called Win Vintage, and have been doing this over 3 years now.
That's awesome. Fun. That is really awesome. Yeah, I love that story. And I think, a lot of people get into this hobby because of a vintage watch, whether it's something that was, handed down to them or a family heirloom. And while a lot of people like me are scared of them, I think that it's a great way to, it sparks interest in the hobby, and it is a way that a lot of people have come into it. And I love that. So what is it about vintage watches that really draws you to them versus more modern pieces?
I like all watches. I like the fact that vintage watches have more of a handmade quality to them, I would say. And they show age and patina, and, I like the stories behind them. Modern watches I still like, but for me, they don't have quite the soul of a vintage watch.
Yeah.
So I love just all the aspects, the design, the history, the people that wore these watches back in the day. I've always been interested in history. I think, the fact that all the watches, modern and vintage, will last hundreds of years is really, really cool if they're properly taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like cars in that way. I think cars used to be, to me, way better made, and it was so personal. People didn't have 3 or 4 vehicles sitting in their driveway. They had one.
Yeah.
And it took a lot of time and effort to pick out exactly what car or truck, whatever that was going to fit the family and their lifestyle. And it was a very personal thing. I feel that way about houses too. Like, I love houses built in the 40s and 50s and 60s, the craftsman style homes that it was just, they were just so better built. Whereas I say that as I'm about to buy a brand new house, but
it's fine.
I still love I like the older houses. I really do. There's just there's a charm about them that I don't see.
I think it's the story behind them. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. Like, I'm pretty sentimental about my watches that I have now, and I like the stories that I'm making with my watches. I remember certain aspects of my life, and I remember what watch I wore. Like, I remember what watch I wore when I bought my house. I remember, those are things that are very significant to me. But then I have these vintage watches, and I'm like, these told a whole other story for somebody. And it's so, and I wish that I had the capability of knowing who wore them and knowing the stories behind them. And I think that's the thing that you kind of miss out on. But I kind of like having my own little story, especially because I have like ladies' vintage pieces. So I think it's kind of fascinating to imagine, what kind of lifestyle these ladies wore or ladies had, and kind of what was going on, and what memories that these watches were a part of. Well, I get to make new ones at the service center.
Yeah, exactly.
Eric, what was the Hamilton watch, by just out of curiosity?
It's called the Neil. Every Hamilton had a male name back in the day. So you have all these, very different than like Submariner, Explorer, things like that. They had actual names. Very simple little watch, round, like 30 millimeters roughly. So very small by today's standards, but with Hamilton had these numerals that were kind of like Breguet numerals.
Yeah.
Kind of fancy, but slightly different versions of those. So yeah,
That's
it had
really
that.
cool.
It's just a classic dress watch.
Yeah, I had a reissue of I think it was called the Lloyd.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
it was
exactly.
like a reissue they did in the 90s of
I
this
remember
watch.
that.
And like you said, it had like Breguet type, font on it, and then this like really curvy squared case. Yeah, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Well, that's awesome, and yeah, your story is incredible, and you've come quite a long way.
Yes.
So you did mention you don't hate modern watches, but I do want to ask, is there any brands or watches that you see now that you really like?
Yeah, I mean, I like obviously the independence.
Yeah.
It's kind of smaller production. A few brands I really like. Obviously Philippe Dufour. I had the chance to spend a day with him, and that was, incredible experience. I'd love to get a Simplicity one day in my collection. I've sold one before, but not keeping one at this present time. But I do think they have a lot of upside. Two good friends of mine started a brand called Peterman Beda that they came out with their first watch recently, which is a Deadbeat Seconds, and they won a GPHG prize.
Oh wow!
Which is incredible. Basically, a year and a half ago, no one had heard of them except me because I knew both of them through Christies. They were our watchmakers during the Geneva exhibition previews during the auctions. And they also helped Christie's with fixing, watches if they needed to be fixed before the auction, servicing them, etc. So they basically took a leap of faith and left their jobs working for Lange to start their own brand. And it's really gone incredibly well for them.
Yeah,
that's great.
Sounds like they know a thing or two about watches.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, they worked for Lange for years, Patek and other brands, and they're just so gifted. So
yeah, it's very unique because a lot of the independents, they either come from the world of watches or they're enthusiasts, very passionate, but like actual watchmakers is kind of a different story. You don't really see that every day. So that's really cool.
Yeah. And then there's a few, micro brands, smaller brands that I like. Oak and Oscar, I'm very good friends with Chase Fancher. I have two, and he's obviously super passionate, awesome guy, great watches for the price.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Autodromo, Bradley Price, I've known for many years. Really cool to see how that brand's kind of grown and disseminated. I was at some event a while back, and this guy's like, yeah, I know you like watches. Look at this Autodromo. And I was like, what? How do you know about that brand? So
cool. That's cool. And we were talking about those guys on the Worn and Wound podcast a couple weeks ago, and Autodromo is one of those brands, and you can say this about Oak and Oscar too. Like when you see one of their watches, there's no doubt about it. Like that's an Oak and Oscar, that is an Autodromo, and I love those brands that are so identifiable and have their own unique style.
Another one last brand that I like is Norcane.
Yeah,
is also a new brand, kind of started by a couple guys that were involved with Breitling before.
Mm-hmm.
Again, kind of launching this out of passion, and it's also really taken off in the course of a year. Very few people had heard of them by the end of 2019, and now it's pretty much a global brand by the end of 2020.
Yeah,
which is pretty amazing in such a short period of time. They're a brand that we've spoken to quite a few times, and we've gotten some hands-on experience. And it's insane how big they've gotten in just
and well deserved. Like their build quality is insane. The movements they're using is really good. They're doing all the right things. They're a lot of times when these new brands, they make some missteps and things like that, but Norcane seems to hit it every time.
And they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the movements are great. They've got chronometer certified movements, great bracelets, just very rock solid watches.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Very well made for sure.
So I did want to ask you before we get into some of our listener questions, I saw you in a video on YouTube, and I think it was Crown and Caliber, but you were playing the drums.
Yeah.
And then I know just listening to you on other podcasts such as Hodinkee, I know you play golf as well. Because I think a question a lot of people sometimes ask us is, Do you wear vintage watches when you're playing the drums or when you're golfing?
No.
Do you wear any watches when playing the drums or golfing?
I don't.
No.
I mean, so first off on drumming, which I'm fortunately getting back into. I'm in a little band down here. We haven't done any we haven't done performances yet, but we do performances for the neighborhood.
That's awesome.
People end up coming over,
though. Especially during these times. I feel like it's just fun to have something to do that's a little different, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So we end up playing. I think some neighbors hate it, but some neighbors come on
whatever
over
it is,
and
what
watch.
it is.
Yeah. But that's fun. I don't like anything on my wrist when I'm drumming. It's just doesn't feel right. For golfing, I don't really like anything on my wrist. Very few golfers wear a watch when they're playing golf.
Yeah.
Phil Mickelson's kind of an exception, but I think he actually uses it as sort of a guide in his swing to know how far his wrist has turned.
Interesting.
And he wears, just kind of odd, he wears like typically a Rolex Cellini on an alligator strap. So it's just kind of really, really odd.
Yeah.
But no, I also don't like anything on my wrist for golf.
Yeah.
But beyond that, the sort of vibrations and impacts of when you're playing those things are obviously not great on any watch, whether vintage or modern.
Yeah.
It just
no matter what they tell you.
It'll just mean that the watch will need service, sooner than it would otherwise, in my opinion.
For sure. Yeah, I can see that. I used to play sports growing up, and I can't imagine like having something on the wrist. Like, it becomes uncomfortable, and you want to be like as free as possible. And, yeah.
I mean, I feel like it's kind of the same thing with any sport, with even cycling or anything like that I don't really understand. And I know people who do it, and more power to you, but the whole like wearing a mechanical watch while you are doing anything that just has a lot of jolting activity. And I know crazy. We talk about increase in shock resistance, things like that, but shock resistance, there's a difference in me dropping a watch from a table onto the floor one time and one big shock versus just repetitive, consistent shock after shock after shock. And even though they're smaller, it's just so consistent that it has to cause a ton of damage.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Omega came out with their $60,000 golf watch for Rory. But
I still want to see this watch, though. It seems kind of amazing.
It does, yeah.
Which he doesn't wear.
He doesn't wear. He wore an Apple Watch recently, and I heard people were not happy at Omega about that.
I'm sure Omega was the least happy of everybody that he's wearing the Apple Watch instead.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Like, dude, come on.
Like, for real.
And remember Odell Beckham Jr. wearing the Richard Mille in the
fake
football
one,
game,
supposedly, because it turned into a whole... I've said this. Daniel Wellington, marketing genius for the way they did that whole thing. They got so much... He got so much publicity for wearing this fake watch, and then all of a sudden he's a Daniel Wellington ambassador, and everybody's talking about Daniel Wellington. It's amazing. It was so genius.
Yep.
It was crazy. Yeah, absolutely crazy.
Oh, that's funny. So let's jump into some of these listener questions, because we got quite a few, and honestly, they're like really good. I did like sift through a lot of them because some of them were kind of crazy and out there, like we usually get. But
but
we got some good ones.
We always get a lot of question about vintage watches, and vintage is a very iffy topic for both of us. I have a few vintage pieces, but I have a very hit and miss experience in my personal vintage, endeavors. But it's a very scary subject, and it's something we are definitely not experts on. So we've avoided the topic until we could get somebody who actually knows what they're talking about on it. So so super excited to go through some of these questions and really get some knowledge.
You want to hit the first one, Catlin?
Yeah, sure. And I love this question because I love the idea of an everyday watch. Can a vintage watch be worn as a daily beater?
I think you can. I wear vintage watches almost exclusively every day, but I guess it really depends on what activities you're doing, aka not drumming or golf, probably with it. If you're operating a jackhammer, that wouldn't be a good one to wear any watch either. But just out and about, absolutely. I think there's a couple things to consider, I guess. One is the environment you live in. If it's very humid, if that's the case, you might want to watch that is a screw down case back versus, like a 1940s Hamilton or something like that.
Really?
It's a lot less water resistant just because it basically pushes on with compression. So moisture can get in. The crowns are not, there's no gaskets in those crowns to help prevent moisture or water from getting in.
Okay.
So if you're around a lot of water, I wouldn't recommend 1930s, Patek Philippe like dress watch or Cartier or something like that, just because moisture is an enemy, obviously, of the movements and dials. So, probably the majority of my business is vintage Rolex, but mostly 1950s through 1970s. And the kind of great thing about those is they obviously have screw down case backs, almost all of them. And you can update the gaskets in the crown and in the back and crystal, and you can make these things still water resistant, which I try to do for all the vintage Rolex watches I sell. I'll check the water resistance and at least tell people if it needs, if it can't be made water resistant or something like that. I'm aware of a few people that have bought high dollar vintage watches, one over 100,000, another like 60 or 70,000 Submariners, and one guy on the plane, moisture formed inside the crystal and dropped on the dial. Probably affected the watch value by $40,000. So because the dial has such a large percentage of the watch, someone else who went out into a humid environment, again, it fogged up and damaged the watch. Probably over $100,000 loss on the watch. That's not really something on your insurance policy. Some policies are not really set up to do that. It's more if it's stolen or something like that, or lost, but not really about damage of the watch, particularly in that sort of context. So you obviously don't want that happening in damaging your watch. We sold a Submariner when I was at Christies. It was just before I started at Christies, and the guy called in and said, I bought this 1970s red Submariner, or Submariners in red, from the auction for whatever it was, $18,000. And he went diving with it and the thing flooded. Yeah. But he just thought it was, water resistant.
Right.
Christies doesn't check or guarantee that. So it was a total loss. He was trying to ask for a refund. Christies wasn't going for that.
No way.
So, there's a lot of people that aren't aware of those things so much.
Yeah.
That's an important part of daily wear.
Yeah.
So watches get to a point where they can no longer be water resistant. It's not just like a replace the seal or something like that.
Only if there's typically some corrosion, which watch cases can rust, even if they're stainless steel. If the watch case is kind of warped or bent, maybe from impacts or things. I've heard of that happening with Royal Oak and Nautilus watches, where the polishing and wear over time means that they can't be made water resistant anymore. So those are definitely things to consider. It's very, very unlikely with vintage Rolex or vintage Omega that it couldn't be made water resistant anymore. Very, very unusual. It requires some sort of severe rust, corrosion, or impacts or bad polishing, something like that.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Or, realistically, I've seen not the best watchmakers open case backs, and then I know that it works.
So
exactly. I would assume that. All right. Well, so I guess as long as you don't wear it in summer in the South, with the humidity here, I will definitely pay much more attention to that from now on.
Yeah.
And
if it is water resistant, you don't have to worry. I mean, I'm in Florida, and you can go in the summer from, air conditioning in your house or in the hotel or restaurant or whatever. It's in the 70s, and you walk out and it's 95 and super humid.
Yeah.
And
you're instantly sweating, and
if your watch is not water resistant, it could fog up immediately inside of the crystal. So that's just something to be aware of. It's that change in temperature that people talk about as an issue.
I've heard people, leaving their watch just like on the counter in their bathroom while they're taking a shower without even thinking about it, because they're taking their glasses off and a watch off, and they've ruined it just because of that too. Yeah. Oh, that would kill me.
And we, about a year and a half ago, or I guess now about 2 years ago, there was a vintage Rolex asylum gathering in Bali, Indonesia that I went to. And obviously super hot there. I mean, 100 degrees and super humid in the jungle. So people were very concerned about bringing their watches, knowing the issues with humidity. And there were two schools of thought. Some people said you want to leave your crown unscrewed so the watch can kind of breathe. Other people were like, no, make sure it's water resistant and seal it. People brought bags of rice in case their watch like fogged up so they could put it in there like an iPhone.
Would that work hypothetically? Because it doesn't seem to ever work on my cell phone.
I know. Yeah, so it was really kind of crazy. I would be more of the school that make sure it's water resistant and it's sealed, and then you're perfectly fine. But people are,
was Bali the right choice for this? Yeah. As much as I like Bali, like
it was just because it was hosted by the group, and that there was like 30 guys in Jakarta, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. So it was like a great place, but it was it was funny. People were very nervous.
I bet.
Like, maybe I'll just show up and not bring a watch. Like, I'll just be that guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, all right. So next question here is, at what age does something become considered vintage?
So the origin of the word is 20 years related to vintage.
Yikes.
But there's two schools. Yeah, obviously there's many schools of thought here. So you could say, okay, 2001 and earlier. There are some that say, for Rolex, it's got to have a tritium dial or earlier. So kind of 1998 and earlier. I'm more of the school, for me at this point, that it's kind of 1980s and earlier, or right around early 80s. For me, like vintage Rolex watches should have the acrylic plexiglass crystals, plastic crystals instead of sapphire. And that, to me, kind of makes the watch more vintage, the overall look, the domed crystal versus these flat crystals that are sapphire, that are reflective, things like that. I like the look of the watch dial through the acrylic crystal that's domed like a vintage Submariner like that versus a 1990 Submariner with this flat piece of sapphire.
Yeah.
So in general, I pretty much sell watches from the early 80s and older.
Okay. That makes sense.
So we're not considered vintage.
No.
Not yet. Yes. Not yet.
Not yet. I know.
It's creeping up on us.
Okay, well, so what about any recommended sites to start reading from before venturing into purchasing a vintage watch?
Yeah, I think one very useful thing is I gave a talk to the Horological Society of New York back in March 2019, and that's a very good primer for collecting vintage watches. It's kind of a year or two of digging around the internet condensed into just over an hour talk.
Yeah, I've actually watched that. It's on YouTube, and it's super informative.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So that's like a good place to start. Then I'm a fan of this blog called Rescapement that Tony Trena started. And he has something called the Curriculum, which is kind of the best articles on different topics.
Oh, cool.
So by brand, or mostly by brand. So you can say, okay, Rolex, if you want to learn more about the GMT Master, click this Hodinkee reference points.
Okay.
You'll see my face in the video. Same for the Submariner or the Omega Speedmaster, and then other articles that are very good about specific models, references, histories.
Yeah.
So that's a great place to start. Obviously, Hodinkee, lots of great content on there.
Yeah.
Revolution has had some awesome articles too.
Yeah, for sure.
Piggybacking off of that just real quick, what would you, if you could literally give somebody just one piece of advice about buying their first vintage watch, what would it be of any brand?
I think the classic buy the seller. You can't, particularly if you don't know what you're doing and not an expert, you can't just go on eBay and click buy whatever because it looks cool.
She totally did that.
There was some alcohol involved. It was okay.
Yeah.
It was fine. A big service bill later. It's okay.
Yeah.
Service bill in like how many months? It was
like a year.
Yeah.
Basically. But COVID, to be fair, like
that's true.
There was like a 3-month shutdown because of COVID. but yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh. Yeah.
But
Listen to
it's,
Eric.
yeah, it's good because unless you have a trained eye, you won't know if the dial has been reprinted, repainted, or is correct. Those aspects can affect the value by 90+% if it's not the original dial. That you just have to work with an expert to know what's correct or not. They represent it as such.
Definitely. Should we be overly concerned with the accuracy of vintage watches?
I'm not personally. Obviously, I like, if possible, to keep the watch within 30 seconds a day or something like that. If the watch was a chronometer, it meant that it went through testing and was sort of +6 seconds or -4 seconds per day.
Yeah.
Those, given that they could be regulated so well at the beginning, can often be pretty well regulated today to be within, 10 seconds either way.
Yeah.
But other watches at the time were not regulated. Like even Omega Speedmasters, things like that were not regulated. So you're not going to get typically within like that chronometer grade when you're even after a service today. So you just have to be comfortable with some variance. When a watch starts getting to be more than a minute per day, then I generally recommend service.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think, if you're a stickler for those few seconds, vintage watches are not for you.
Go quartz.
Yeah, exactly.
I love seeing those arguments on the forums and such when people are like, it's +2 seconds a day. How dare this watch? I'm going to send it back in for servicing.
I don't even know how you time something out to be +2.
I honestly
if it's at 5 minutes, I would never notice. I'm just whatever. And even if it's 5 minutes, I would just probably assume I said it wrong that day.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Like when my vintage piece got to be hours off in one day, I remember we were sitting at the dining room table downstairs, and I was like,
"That's a problem."
Yeah, maybe we should fix this. So
exactly.
And now a word from today's sponsor. Hodinkee, the preeminent resource for all things watches, has recently announced a new venture, Houdinki Insurance. Created in partnership with Chubb, the world's premier insurer of valuable collections, Houdinki Insurance is a game changer in how you protect the watches you love. Signing up takes just a few minutes, and in most cases, you can instantly protect your watches with comprehensive insurance backed by two of the most trusted names in their industries. In most cases, you won't need independent appraisals or sales receipts, and you won't even have to speak with an agent to get your quote. The ease in which you can apply for Houdinki Insurance and get coverage makes insuring traditionally difficult timepieces, such as vintage watches, better now than ever. Not to mention the added peace of mind that comes with the appreciation protection, guaranteeing up to 150% of your watch's value up to the policy limit, ensuring fair value during an ever-changing watch market. Hodinkee Insurance is available to U.S. residents in all 50 states. Visit insurance.hodinkee.com or download the Hodinkee app for iOS or Android to learn more and sign up today. I'm talking about actually quartz watches. So is vintage quartz, as far as, I know obviously quartz only goes back so far. Is there a big issue with servicing some of those older quartz movements that you know of?
Yes. The sort of most collectible, largest, most well-known vintage quartz movement would be the Beta 21 watches, which those were featured in Patek Philippe, Omega, Piaget, and others. If those break, they're not really, as far as I know, something that can be fixed. Oh. You pretty much have to get a new movement or something like the Beta 22 or something like that, which replaces it. But then that affects the value of the watch significantly because collectors that buy it want the original movement. So I have a friend who has two of the early Seiko Astron watches from 1969. So the very first quartz watches. But he had them for years. Neither worked well.
Okay.
He finally found someone in Australia that said they could work to restore the movement. Everyone else said it's not possible. You're going to have to replace it, which he didn't want to do. So he just had them sitting for years.
Oh, wow.
And he kind of was able to finagle it somehow. So they are working now. But it's, that sort of whole electronic approach is not like a mechanical watch where it's easy to interchange. You got, you've got all different kind of electronic parts that wear out. So it's generally not something I recommend collecting, if you care about the longevity, because I don't know how these things will do in 100 years, whereas like a Rolex Submariner will be fine in 100 years if properly cared for.
Absolutely. Do you see like a lot of the quartz issues being related to like corrosion with people, have left batteries in them and stuff like that?
That's part of it, but I think the little circuits and boards wear out and things too, and it's not like something easily replicable in terms of producing these little microchips and stuff.
Yeah. I have an old, I forgot what it's called. It's just an old Timex. It's one of their like electric models that they did. And I remember I bought it on eBay, super risky. It was very...
Eric hates us, by the way. He's like, y'all are done. I'm not coming on this podcast ever again.
Super cheap, and I took a chance. It was beautiful, and it was in great condition, came in the original box and everything. Put a new battery in it, and nothing happened. And then I was reading deep into some forums, and they're like, you basically have to like jump start this thing, and like I had to flick it like in my hand really, really hard, and it was basically like reviving the movement, and boom, it just started to go again. And
that's awesome.
I was like, this, I don't know if like it was kind of scary.
Maybe this isn't the thing.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't the thing. Yeah, and I have had an Omega Constellation that had a quartz movement inside, and luckily it ran fine. But it was like a '90s model, so I wasn't really too worried about it. But yeah, I can see there being some major issues, and I know people love the Oyster. Is it the Oyster quartz from Rolex?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really. I don't know how
those.
I've heard bad things about servicing that watch too.
Yeah, often they have to replace the movements too.
Oh, okay.
So that's I don't know, $1,000. So it's not inexpensive.
Yeah.
I had a Beta 21 Omega recently. I bought, not typically something I would buy, but I bought it basically for its gold weight, and it was running. But then I learned, the date is not advancing when I move the time forward, and had it looked at, and there's a tiny little like plastic gear inside that they just break because it's like a plastic thing. And it's impossible to find anywhere. And basically the watch is kind of, it's tough because you're going to be stuck on the same date forever, and you can't even change the date. So it's not good.
That's a bummer.
All right. Well, so are there any brands, vintage models to avoid?
Yeah. So, I was thinking about this question. There are some brands that are sort of fraught with risk, and there are brands today that we see as luxury that were not so great back in the day. And there are brands that are really great in the past that are not so great today. Like Anacar is a good example. Now, Anacar is basically these Chinese fashion watches that are really ugly, but back in the day, they made awesome watches. There's brands like Cuervo y Sobrinos, where basically all the vintage ones you see were made up and they're not real. There's Baume and Mercier. It was kind of hit and miss back in the day. They're not like awesome brand today either generally, but some people think these vintage Baume, it's vintage Baume, it should be super high quality, but some of them definitely were not. The Ulysse Nardin, obviously pretty expensive watch today. The vintage models, there's a lot of like made in South America ones that are put together, not real, that people think are real. And they were just such a small brand. It's hard to really have a good picture on collecting them.
Yeah.
So there's definitely, an array of things. Some people that I was trying to think of more specific examples, but like Movado today, the watches are obviously subpar, but back in the day, they make watches that could be 50,000 plus, some of their super rare chronographs.
Yeah, I think that's pretty typical. We've seen a lot of these brands kind of become more of a fashion brand now. And they didn't start out that way, unfortunately.
Exactly.
Well, I don't think I realized that replica vintage watches were as big. I mean, obviously, if you got into, the Submariner, things like that, things that are really popular, but I would have never thght to consider many other brands is having a big like replica market.
Yeah.
So that's a scary thing to think about.
There's a few that it's just the whole brand is littered with lots of fakes from eBay and things like that.
Yeah.
I know, like even Oris. I've seen, Oris has a lot of like fakes online and stuff.
They do actually, yeah.
I know it's very strange.
Right.
It
I
is.
need to not drink and buy vintage watches anymore. I need to pay a little more attention.
Exactly. Exactly.
Someone asked, when does a tropic dial add value and when does it hurt its value, and what to look for between the two?
It's really subjective.
Okay.
Obviously, people like tropical dials that are very brown and even.
Okay.
But that's very few. A lot they've aged with spots and imperfectly and crazing, where kind of the lacquer on the dial cracks.
Okay.
A lot of people don't want that. Very uneven, where maybe the right side of the dial is much more brown than the left.
Okay.
Or it's really, obviously a lot of people call dials tropical that are actually just water damaged. So that's like it's a common marketing ploy by dealers and auction houses.
Yeah.
So you don't want that either. Obviously, you want to check out the movement and make sure it's in good condition.
Yeah, I've seen some
not
pretty gnarly dials that look almost like they've got mold growing on them. It's like, look at this beautiful tropic dial. I'm like, no, that's not.
Yeah, exactly. It's very subjective. Some people find that, sort of thing interesting. But in general, if it's a very even brown color, it's going to be highly desirable.
That's kind of like do they call it spider dials, where the dial has cracked?
Where it cracks.
Some people love that. And I just think like the watch looks broken. I don't know that I love that.
I think the reality is 99% of watch collectors hate that.
Yeah.
But people had to do something to market it.
Yes.
So they call it that.
They have all these cracked dials sitting around and needed to sell them somehow.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Okay, well, so let's talk about beginner vintage watches. What are some of your recommendations for somebody who's just now getting into vintage and kind of wants to buy their first vintage piece?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, there's all different ways to go here. Obviously, part of it depends on like the aesthetic you like. If you like dress watches or sport watches, a very good entry point watch, like typically under $2,000, is the Vulcan Cricket, which is a little bit more dressy, but an alarm watch. They're getting harder to find, actually, and prices have moved up a lot the last 6 months, I would say.
Okay.
But really interesting watches, great history tied to the American presidents,
nice.
Starting with Harry Truman, pretty much all the way through. President Biden received one when he was vice president and wore it frequently.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Yeah. So, and I wrote about that on Hodinkee. I was sort of the first to spot it back in the day. But,
nice.
Just a cool thing. But I like the history of those. I mean, a Rolex Datejust is sort of a watch you can't fail with. You know, a 36 millimeter Datejust from the 60s through the 80s or 90s. Very good kind of entry point for a lot of people.
Still looks good today.
Yeah.
I think 70s and 80s and 90s Speedmasters are extremely undervalued, say $5,000 in that range, maybe a little more. And the quality, the history, the size, because a lot of people like larger watches still. It's a perfect watch you can have the rest of your life. Those are kind of the mainstay icons, and then you can delve into all kinds of unusual watches from Longines. Vintage AP dress watches from the 70s can be extremely undervalued if you want something like that, like under $5,000 for an AP in gold. It's just whether you want that sort of look. There's just, the world is pretty endless. The Hodinkee shop, their vintage watches they launch weekly, is a real good place to see a lot of things at generally under $10,000. I wholesale a lot of watches through there. It just helps me focus on higher value pieces. but it's a great way for someone who's getting into watches to get a great watch in good condition.
I have it saved like on my Instagram because I think it's absolutely stunning. It was a Tag Heuer. Dang, I forgot the model now.
Now Tavia or Carrera or Skipper, Monaco.
I think it was a version of the Monaco, and it was in a gold case, and I had never seen one before, and they had like this green strap on it, and it was just stunning.
Cool.
They have some great stuff. I look forward to their vintage posts. The posts that they do, because there's always some really cool stuff. I feel like they have, or at least what they have in the shop is usually stuff that I really like aesthetically. So
it is, and it's a great. I always recommend, because I don't often stock a lot of things under $10,000. I just ship it to them to sell, but it's a great place for someone to find an awesome watch and like have the real full history of the watch, and they're ready to. The watches are like ready to go on your wrist and be worn. So
for sure, and I think I'm pretty sure that Hodinkee like puts it in their like nice little watch case and roll that comes with it too. Yeah. And I had a friend that sent me a watch that he sent it to me in one of their cases, and it's phenomenal. And I was super jealous because I wanted one, which I could just go online and buy one.
It's like the bubble wrap package.
It's super nice. Like it's their packaging is really nice with it too.
Yeah,
you
definitely.
Feel like you're almost getting a new watch with their setup, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely.
So this next question is actually pretty interesting because I know you have 2 little kids. What are some actual vintage watches that can stand up to daily wear with a 6-year-old?
Very specific age.
That's a good question. I think, any vintage Rolex or maybe Speedmaster, anything. I mean,
more the sports watch type thing.
Yeah, you can wear anything. I don't wear typically a lot of the non-water resistant cases day to day.
Yeah.
Just because you worry about even washing your hands, necessarily water like splashing in where the crown is and touching the dial. But I mean, it's pretty easy to wear almost anything.
Yeah. Unless they're spilling something on it, you're going to get all the little kid, I'm sure, peanut butter and all the gooey sticky stuff.
I have the best 6-year-old ever because like he never made messes or got dirty or anything. I don't know. I feel like my 6-year-old experience is much different than the average 6-year-old experience. So.
Yeah. That's great. That's true.
Well, question: do your kids? Do they? Obviously, you probably have watches coming and going like crazy. Do they pay attention? Do they have any interest?
Yeah, Charlie really likes gold watches, which is funny.
He's
like, gold, and then if it's on a gold bracelet, even better.
Got some good taste.
Yeah, Lena really. She's 2, my daughter. She likes everything, and she's like very captivated by looking at it. She'll like grab my wrist and want to pull it and look at it for a second and then move on. But yeah, it's funny. Lena is really, I feel like we joke that she's going to inherit the business because she really likes watches. Charlie's more into sports and things like that. He likes watches too, but not
only if they're really shiny.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That's funny.
That's awesome. Okay, so what is your favorite vintage watch brand? And then what is your favorite brand that needs to make a comeback, in your opinion?
It's hard to pick a favorite because I just love so many of them. I mean, I first really got into it with vintage Heuer watches, the predecessor of Tag Heuer. So I really liked the Carreras and the Octavias, the Monacos, and then the older watches, chronographs from the 1940s and 50s. I love those. Obviously, I love vintage Rolex. I love Gallet is one of my favorite brands. Amazing chronographs, particularly their chronographs from the 40s through the 60s. But the clamshell chronographs they made in the 40s are just incredibly beautiful. They're 34.5, but kind of substantial in size. And I love wearing those and looking at them. And they're pretty rare. Vulcan crickets. I've probably got the nicest cricket collection in the world. Not to brag, but I love crickets.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And then obviously vintage Patek Philippe is kind of next level. I love any steel Patek Philippe watch, whether it's a time only or chronograph, just very pure. But the Omega Speedmaster as well has always been a sort of special watch to me.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, your cricket collection. I think you're smart to collect them because obviously the more information we have now through people like you and articles and such, it's getting harder and harder to find watches and good deals and those they're not as easy to come by so much anymore.
Like the hidden gems. Those aren't. Yeah.
Well, we have a friend on Instagram. I think her Instagram handle is like Erin EDC, and she just picked up an Omega Speedmaster reduced, and I've had two of those, and they were like great prices. The rumor was like they're super hard to service, which I've had two. I had one service, and it wasn't any harder than any other watch I had, so I don't understand the controversy there, but you could find those for like, you used to find them for like $1,200, and now they're entering to like $2,000, $3,000. I'm like, what? Oh, yeah. It's so crazy. But if you have smaller wrists, like these Speedmasters are so awesome for the smaller wristed folks, and they have like this little vintage appeal to them too that I really like. But yeah, it's if you like vintage, like now's the time to jump in on it.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, how have you seen the market change? Because from our side, it seems like vintage watches have been making a steady growth in the last few years. We see a lot more vintage collectors. We see a lot more vintage forums, vintage sellers. So I'm sure like it's been pretty consistent in growth.
Yeah, I think people don't realize how hot the market is and how it's absolutely exploded, I would say, from April to now. Oh. So there's new collectors, anything in great condition, I can sell in 1 or 2 phone calls. That's unusual. And it was much harder, say, in February. Yeah. It really is kind of insane. People don't realize how much the market has taken off. Yeah. And obviously you can see it a little bit with like Hodinkee. Things sell out in like 1 minute, often cases. But the auction prices are insane that we're seeing, starting with the June auctions in Geneva last year. And I think values are just going to explode even more.
Yeah. Do you think that has anything to do with the fact that a lot of these, brands today like Rolex and Patek are so hard to get a hold of that people are looking to vintage a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think people are more bored with more money to spend because they're not traveling. And
who are these people? I need to meet them.
Yeah. Yeah. They've had more time to pursue hobbies.
Yeah, that's true.
Some people looking to diversify, but it really comes down to a group of people that are wanting to build collections of the best things and get real joy in collecting and buying like very special watches. So
that's really cool.
It's been great to see. I would say I've seen kind of ups and downs the last 5-6 years I've been doing this. 2015, there was kind of a lot of growth in vintage watches. 2016 as well. 2017, 2018 is really when this modern hysteria came into play with all this above retail stuff. And that was a real shift. And 2019 was similar. Like, the prices we saw, it wasn't like, I remember like 2017, 2018, you could go into a Rolex retailer, particularly in 2017, and just buy a Submariner if you wanted to. They're readily available, or that you'd get one within a week.
Yeah.
But that all changed, in 18, 19. I felt like that really overshadowed the vintage market, particularly in 19. And then 20, it just took off.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Very cool.
So what is your opinion on new watches with a vintage design versus like authentic vintage watches?
I'm supportive in general of the vintage inspired designs.
Oh, really?
I think I like vintage inspired designs if they're executed well. Beautiful dials. I think that there was a real technical aspect to these watches back in the day where it was about legibility, real thought that went into the design. And my sense was in the 80s and 90s, a lot of that disappeared. It was like more flashy, really didn't have to do with the technical tool aspects of the watch. But I think that really grounds these things and the principles, the golden rule, all these different sort of principles that were applied to watch design. So I like going back, to when legibility was more important and things like that. But of course, in general, I'd take the vintage one over the modern one almost any time. One of the watches where I think actually the modern watch is almost better than the vintage models is some of the Reversos. I've got a Reverso tribute to 1931, which is based on the original, and the size is better. Obviously, the movement's more reliable, and the vintage ones are very, very small from the 1930s, and I like the modern ones more. But it's like a really great update on how it should be.
Well, that's good to know. I really like those watches. We got to go hands-on with one at a local dealer here, and I feel like it's a perfect watch for those like people that like fidget spinners, because I would just be playing with it all day. It's the same way when I wear a dive watch, I turn my bezel constantly. But
great.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's like, I love watches that have that, like, it's a complication that's useful to this one specific thing.
Yeah.
And it, outside of that, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but I think that they're really cool. And I think they're just a fun piece to talk about, especially with other people that don't know about watches.
Yeah.
It's something
It's
like
a
really interesting.
Sure.
I think it's really cool.
Yeah, definitely.
There was, what is it, like the Regatta Omegas that were like for, I don't even know what the sport is.
For yacht racing.
The yacht racing. Yeah, I don't know how to use it. I would never know how to use it, but I think it's cool as hell. Like it's just
5-minute chronograph is all it is.
Yeah,
that's exactly. All it is.
I mean, that's all you need. It's a 5-minute chronograph. But I love, and Omega did the apnea too, which was for free diving.
Okay.
And it was essentially the same thing. So you're talking about the ones that have like the colorful rings on them.
Yeah, little ring.
But yeah, like it is a conversation. Seeing like all of these little colors change on the dial, and
I feel like if I were to go vintage, I would get something like that, something that was just like really crazy and specific to the time and the sport and whatever. I just think those are really cool.
Vintage is cool because I feel like there's so much, like, especially when you go, I love the idea of 70s vintage. Everything is so just funky and out there. And like when I think of the 70s, like I think of everything being over the top curvy, and everything was super futuristic for no reason, because everybody thought we were going to be the Jetsons. And if they could see us now stuck at home all day, every day, doing nothing, they would be so devastated that their idea never happened. But everything just has this like super curvy and futuristic feel to it. And I think it's so fun.
I know. It is funny to see what they thought we would be at today.
They'll look at us now.
Yeah. And now the 80s is sort of beginning to take off with the black PVD watches. And, that's the next thing to move, really.
Really?
Funny.
I wonder how, I'm worried about buying a PVD watch now. Like, I love the new Seiko, the Seiko 5 with just the black. Like, I love that all black. I keep wanting an all black watch, but I don't want to spend a whole bunch of money. So to me, that makes sense. But I know how rough I am now, and I wonder how the vintage pieces hold up. I guess I forget that PVD goes back vintage.
They get some scratches, but that can almost add character to the watch. It looks cool.
Really?
So you see the brassy color underneath. It's interesting.
Yeah. I'm always so scared too. Like I
need to just do it. I'm just
and I've heard the DLC is supposed to be a little harder, a little tougher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is.
But they do look freaking awesome. I love that Tudor chronograph, that all black.
Oh yeah,
it's so cool looking.
Yeah, the all black is
all
amazing.
Black. Everything they do just looks really cool. They should do more of those.
I feel like Tudor is really kind of the only brand in modern that does a whole lot in like an all black kind of situation.
Yeah, you're right.
So it's super cool.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we'll begin to wrap it up. Okay. We'll end with one last one here. Someone asked, are King Seikos a good buy? Do you feel like they're a good buy?
I think so. I've only ever had a couple of them. It's not my thing exactly. Yeah. Not because I don't like them. It's a whole universe, I feel like, of study to understand if the dials are correct or not.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the Seikos, just by virtue of what they were sort of modded or modified, if you will. So they had swap dials and all kinds of different things. There's just a an abundance of aftermarket Seiko parts around dials, particularly things like that. So to kind of study a reference and then, now is this dial correct or not for this watch and like this year, and all these little aspects would take a lot of study. And obviously most King Seikos are sort of under $1,000.
Yeah.
I think so. That amount of time to study to make a $100 or $200 selling it after all this work doesn't work. But I think that they're really great watches. Same with Grand Seiko, that's taken off like insane, the vintage models, just with all the interest in the new models. But again, there's a lot of little pitfalls and things to understand. So it would take a lot of study, I think, for me to feel comfortable knowing I'm selling like 110% correct product.
They do feel like they're in a whole different realm than everything else. They've got this just world of their own horology and history and stuff that is so different than the way everyone else kind of did it. But I think they're beautiful watches for sure.
Definitely.
And then just a kind of a fun question I wanted to ask was, I know you've probably come across a lot of fakes, and I was curious if you've ever seen anything that you like almost like tricked you in your eyes that was so good that was kind of scary.
I've seen a fair amount of vintage Rolex fakes, I guess, that can be scary good. The older fakes, because these have been collectible for a long time, back in like the 1980s, are almost harder to distinguish in some aspects because it was more handmade. Modern fakes are kind of using CNC machining and lasers and other stuff, so you can tell.
Okay.
But I've seen people that bought vintage Daytonas back in the 1990s in gold, and you start having to really study to see oh, wow, this is all fake on its face when you first see it. Oftentimes these had real dials.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And maybe even real crowns and pushers and bezels, but then you have to look at the case and the movement are fake. And I've seen that with like reference 6062s, it's the more complicated Rolex where it's automatic, but it has a moon phase and a full calendar, the day of the week, the date and month. And these people were faking these back in the 80s, and it's very tricky to kind of examine. I mean, when you start to look a little deeper, you see things that are off, but the older fakes are tough. And Cartier also has a lot of fakes in their vintage watches.
Really?
Even dating back to the 1960s, these things were very collectible and valuable. So there's old fakes from then that pretty much fool everybody today.
Wow.
So,
man,
scary stuff. I mean, just the fact that they like were using some real parts too. I mean, they were like hardcore, man. Okay.
I've seen vintage Patek Philippe like chronographs that actually are a real movement back in the 80s before they started doing extracts from the archives. A lot of people would buy their pocket watch chronographs, which had obviously a real movement, and then make a case around it to make it a wristwatch. So you've got an authentic movement, but then it gets complicated. They'll take numbers from a real watch that sold at auction and put it in there, but then you Google or research and find that exact watch, but with a different case and different looking dial.
Yeah.
And there's duplicates of the same watch around. So it's pretty crazy.
Oof. Y'all do your homework if you're buying vintage. That's all I can say.
I don't know if I feel better or worse about buying vintage watches.
I think, like Eric mentioned, like buying from a trusted source is everything. And that's probably the simplest way to go about it. I feel like just, go with the experts that know what they're looking for. Don't try to figure it out on your own, especially. But,
no, it's true.
Well, Eric, we so appreciate you being on the show today. This was actually like maybe the most informative episode I think we've had. Like, I really enjoyed it.
No, it's awesome. And I hope we can meet one day.
Absolutely. We'd love to come to Florida, or we're dying to come. We're just like,
we're down to go to Florida at any point.
Okay, good. And feel free to text me at any time before you make any more impulsive eBay purchases.
We will. We promise.
Funny, I buy all of my vintage watches while at the beach in Florida. So.
Oh, that's true. That's true. A little too much. Yeah, too much tequila going on.
Too much tequila. It's okay. It's fine. Yeah. Well, so Eric, where can everybody find you? Where can everybody find your business? Where can they go?
I'm on Instagram at Eric M. Wind, ERICMWIND. I've got a website, windvintage.com. I don't update it as much as I would like to, given that things are selling so quickly. So that's just a good place, though, to see a lot of press and other things that are going on. Those are probably the two best ways to kind of keep up with what I'm doing.
Cool. Perfect. And if somebody is looking for a particular vintage watch that you don't have in stock, are you somebody that they can go to source from?
They can always, I get probably 10 emails a day.
Okay.
From people looking for something, but oftentimes I just say that's like such an unusual, rare thing. You should just set up an alert on eBay or Chrono24. Or someone writing me wanting a Rolex with a Dux Unlimited dial, which is very unusual for the organization. I said, I've never had one. I doubt I will have one in the next 50 years. So just set up an eBay alert and Chrono24 and that's your best bet. Yeah. But if you're looking, the more specific information, the better in terms of budget and range and things like that.
Cool.
I don't like birth year watches, so all I ask is people don't ask me to help them find a birth year or something like that.
Why don't you like birth year watches? I feel like this is a hot topic.
Yes.
Screw it in the episode. Why don't you like birth year watches?
So two things. Gave an explanation about this in my Horological Society of New York talk as well. It was like my first thing that I really don't like, but it's a couple reasons. One, it's very difficult to define what even a birth year watch is because with Rolex, you often have, or any brand, like a case production year, say 67, and then the watch was probably assembled and tested in 68. Then it might not have been sold for 2 years after.
You're crushing everybody who has a birth year watch right now.
Yes. But I've seen like the Rolex Milgauss 6541, where it's got a case production 1958, and I've seen a couple that weren't sold until 1965 because it was such a unusual watch and very few people wanted it. So you've got like a massive gap there. So what is it? Is it a 58 birth? 58 birth year watch because of the case. So people don't really understand that. First of all, it's not like a car where you're buying a 2019, whatever.
Right.
But so that's the first thing. Two, someone looking for a birth year watch is just checking it off on their list of what they want in life, and they're not really a collector. I find that's probably the only vintage watch they will ever buy. So if I go to this great effort to buy, find them something, they're like never going to buy another vintage watch in their life, probably, because that's their criteria. A collector would say, I want a Submariner in good condition, like from the 60s or 70s, and this is my budget. Like that's a collector approach, because they're, obviously there's differences, but say you want a Meter's first Submariner, they made that over, 3 years basically with a matte dial. So you can say, I want that because I like that configuration.
Yeah.
But this kind of specific 1 year criteria is, to me, kind of foolish.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I agree with you because I think a lot of people get in their heads like, I need a chronograph, I need a diver, I need a birth watch. And I know that for a while I was looking for a birth watch. There's not a lot out that was like really cool in 1991. I'll be honest with you. So I think that it's like, why limit yourself to getting something you don't even like just because it was made in the year you were born? So I totally agree with that.
All right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. And on that note, guys, don't email Eric for your birth year watch request.
Yeah, exactly.
But this was so much fun. We really appreciate it. Listeners, you guys can head over to our website, www.tennninto.com. We'll have show notes that I'm kind of cringing about putting together because we've talked about a lot of different things today. And make sure you follow us along on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 10-2 Media.
Yep.
And that is all, y'all.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.